A cybersecurity incident can happen to any organization, but being prepared can make all the difference. Most businesses don't think about incident response until it's too late. But when every second counts, will your team know exactly what to do or be forced to figure it out as they go? Good morning, everyone. I'm Lindsay Usherwood, and this is Techless with Lindsay. And today I have here with us Theresa Pickens. Theresa is our compliance paralegal here at Usherwood. And while she does a lot of things in the security and compliance space, one of her biggest achievements here is getting Usherwood to SOC 2 Type 2 compliance and keeping us there. So welcome, Theresa.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about incident response. And what that really means is, you have a security incident in your office, on your network infrastructure, with your IT team or one of your employees. And so when we say incident response, that's what we're talking about today. Theresa, do you want to kind of give a little bit about SOC 2 compliance and incident response and kind of how these things work together?
The biggest thing with SOC 2 compliance is that we protect the security and confidentiality of all of our information, both for Usherwood and for all of our clients, and that we practice what we preach, basically. So everything that we say we're doing and the policies that we have in place, we follow through with for each incident. So the big things of incident response in SOC 2 are preparation, making sure that we test and practice our incident response plans, documentation, making sure that everything that we do during an incident response is documented, and then also lessons learned. So when we go through an incident and inevitably we learn that there's room for improvement or some type of gap that needs to be addressed, we follow through with making sure that we make those improvements so that the next incident doesn't see those same issues.
Thanks for explaining. And while today we aren't really here to talk about SOC 2, I think it's kind of an important primer that kind of explains some of the things that we're going to talk about. Whether you have SOC 2 certifications or not, there's some really good practices that you could implement within your business that are easy to understand and easy to follow. So I guess let's go back to the beginning. And in incident response, I think the first thing everybody thinks that is, oh no, we need a lawyer. And while that's probably true most of the time, I guess, Theresa, from your point of view, when does a technical issue become a legal issue?
So what we've seen is that this shift happens a lot earlier than most people expect, and that's because not every disruption in a business clearly screams, we need a lawyer, right? But that doesn't mean that legal advice and legal counsel isn't important or necessary early on in an incident response. So events tend to happen in one of three major categories. So there's operational outages where your systems are down, maybe your internet's out, there's some type of service interruption. Then there's the big ones, a security incident. So there's some type of suspicious activity happening on your network, or maybe some unauthorized access. And then, worst case scenario, which this happens further down the road, but some type of reportable breach. So your organization gets confirmation that sensitive data has been exposed. And this early classification of the type of incident that you're handling is important because it'll help you understand how the response needs to be handled and the documentations that are required. So teams that involve legal at this stage or even before the stage of categorization will often have a better driven incident response. We're lucky here at Usherwood. We're a little unique in that we have our own in-house general counsel who sits on the incident response team. And like I said, this is unique. Not a lot of MSPs have their own in-house counsel sitting on incident response teams that can help guide incident classification, advise on documentation that is required, and even help decide when outside counsel truly is needed. It might not be as early as people think, or it might be earlier than companies expect.
Yeah, I think the point that you brought up about or data classification is super important because, as you mentioned before, if you have a service outage, maybe you have some sort of business interruption loss, but maybe the data doesn't have any sensitive information. And so having a lawyer maybe is not necessary, but, definitely involving your insurance agent and your insurance brokerage to kind of help you guide you through that in case you do have business interruption. But if the data that is, accessed or breached, becomes important to involve legal, because if it is sensitive data, then there may trigger notification laws based on what state you're in or what industry you're in, or even sometimes like the contracts that you have with your clients.
Yes, exactly. And what you can and can't say, or should and shouldn't say.
Right. And I think we could do a whole nother podcast about when do you call things a breach? And maybe
Yeah, exactly.
pick that up at the end quick as a quick. Teresa, in your experience, what are the biggest mistakes you see companies making during incident response?
Oh, so the biggest one that I see is companies trying to fix the issue too quickly. So obviously in our world and we're constantly moving at the speed of light. We don't have time for business interruption. We're trying to fix things and move on and get back to business as usual. But when this happens too soon in an incident where, IT companies like reset systems or restore from backup or even like clear alerts or information that may have popped up, this can destroy forensic evidence that might be needed later on in the response or post recovery needed by lawyers or insurance.
I think it's super important to think about, there's a difference between containment and restoration. And I think that's a big thing people miss, is that containment, 100%, you have to contain the situation, especially if, there is sensitive data involved. But the recovery and restoration, sometimes you need to take a pause, say, okay, we're contained. What comes next? And that's where you can kind of have that analysis of, okay, what was the data involved? Do we need insurance? Do we need lawyers? Kind of what's the next step from there?
Another area where we see mistakes often is in communication. Like we already said earlier, knowing what to say, how to say it, when to say it, and most importantly, when not to say. You mentioned calling something a breach. It's the easiest that, it's the most common phrase, but as soon as you call something a breach, you can be triggering legal or regulatory obligations. So you don't want to say that unless a lawyer has told you to say that. And then there's just that fine line of balancing how much, oversharing and undersharing, and not giving too much information, but not leaving anything, up to the imagination for people to make their own assumptions.
In our space, right, us being an MSP, a managed service provider for other companies who outsource some or all of their IT to us, what do you think is something that's maybe misunderstood about our relationship with our clients that we could clarify?
Well, I think a lot of the times people assume that an MSP, being the IT, arm of a company, that they're responsible for the entire incident response. And that's not necessarily true. And that foundation is established in the contract at the beginning of the relationship.
I think that's a great point, is that, starting the relationship on the right foot and laying out who's responsible for what, super important. There's definitely some relationships where it's the MSP is the total outsource, like we do everything. And then there's other relationships where there's some give and take and it's more of a co-managed relationship. And so having those expectations early can definitely aid in a recovery effort, if an incident should occur. A company has a security incident, there's containment, there's recovery. So moving into kind of the recovery phase, what do you feel is really important, after an incident, towards the tail end of, okay, we've recovered, what happens next?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, that lessons learned step. So it's important to get all of the appropriate stakeholders involved. And that can often be your executive team, legal, certainly your IT team, and then maybe any third parties that you had help you with assist you through the incident. But getting them all together and saying, what went wrong? Could we have prevented this from going wrong? So did someone make a mistake or was there a gap in our process? And then how do we fix it to prevent it from happening in the future? So the constant training and education of your teams is the most important post-incident.
Yeah, post-incident. I like that, because I think that there's so many new things that are happening. And like you mentioned, MFA was this thing that was supposed to, save us from all these cybersecurity incidents. But then, of course, the people who want to do bad things caught on to that and now use it as their attack sector, right? So I think like something you mentioned about is proper planning and, policies. And so having an incident response policy, I kind of want to talk a little bit about that is, what can you do before you have an incident in terms of creating a policy and kind of what does that mean, right?
Right. So I always say what's the most important step in incident response? It's not what you're doing during the incident, it's what you've done before the incident. So I can't say enough about preparation in things like incident response planning, writing your policies, training and educating your people. The organizations who are well planned and practiced have the most successful and efficient responses. That old saying, fail to plan, then you're planning to fail, is so true in incident response. So you want to make sure that not only do you have an incident response plan, but you review it annually. And you review it not just to check the box exercise with your, compliance team or your documentation specialist, but you actually sit down with all of the key members of the incident response team and say, does this still make sense for your role in this? And more times than not, year over year, that's going to change. You're going to learn a lot throughout the year and you're going to change those roles and those responsibilities. And then I think the most important thing and something that we've really excelled on is conducting annual testing. So tabletop exercises where you simulate an incident going wrong and you just walk through it with all of the incident response team and the appropriate people to see how you would react and how you would recover. And that you'd be surprised, well, not you, but a lot of people would be surprised how much that brings up and how much that highlights. And it's almost always very simple things. So, like we didn't have the right person linked to this responsibility, or we didn't have the right language listed for this communication. So those are little things that you can fix before you're in the heat of the moment and it's just crisis mode. So yeah, preparation is definitely the most important thing.
I love that. Preparation is also the hardest thing to do because
Yeah.
I know when we had our tabletop, it was 3 hours long, and by the end, I was absolutely exhausted, and I feel like I couldn't think anymore. But it was such a good exercise to do just what you said, right? Like we set up a case of, okay, here's what happens next. Who does what, right? And it's super important to go through that because, like you mentioned, when it's actually happening and you feel like you're in crisis mode, the best thing to do is have a plan. And wow, that exhausted me for about a week. It was exercise, and so agree with you. It's really good for people to kind of think about doing.
Yeah, it kind of gives you that muscle memory where
Like,
you just you go into, you just know what to do when an actual incident happens. So it's a really important step.
yeah, it's no different than when you're on an airplane and they tell you how to buckle your seatbelt and unbuckle your
Right.
seatbelt every single time. You're like, okay, I know how to do this. But what they're really doing is it's scientific, right? You're creating muscle memory and understanding in a crisis, you're going to revert back to that muscle memory. And so, yes,
Exactly.
that's a pretty good takeaway. Speaking of takeaways, from your point of view, is there anything that maybe we haven't talked about today that you feel, if someone were new to the incident response space or new to coming up with a plan, any one takeaway that you would give them to kind of get them started?
Well, the one takeaway, it's not something that we've missed. We've definitely already spoken about it a bunch, but it's make sure you have a functioning incident response plan that everyone understands. Make sure you educate your teams, your employees, on how to correctly handle incident response appropriate to their function in the company. And then lastly, the tabletop exercises. It can't say enough about how important it is to practice that response. It'll pay off in, time, money, effort in the event that you have an actual interruption or incident.
Awesome. All right. Well, that's it for us today. Thank you, Theresa, for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Lindsay.